start recording here, and angle this where we can see. So what I have here is just my bridge scene. I'm going to render out a test batch of images so you can get an idea of how this works. You can't see any of that because I haven't turned the screen on. All right, I wonder how long it would have taken before somebody would have said something. All right, I thought I had gotten everything. There we go. So that's loading up. I'm also sharing the screen if you wanted to use WebEx, but I'm also recording this. So that means, in a couple minutes or when all this is said and done, I'll upload it and you can have it to just rewatch. How's that going, by the way? Are the videos working okay for you? Okay, hopefully that's beneficial. And like I said, you can always watch those at 1.5 speed as opposed to me in real life, which is at 0.75 speed. Okay, so we talked about this. What we're seeing here is a camera view, right? We're looking through a camera. And we can create more cameras, but by default, we're in the perspective camera, PRSP, perspective. And that's just a default camera that is in Maya, and that means we can tumble around. We saw earlier that an orthographic camera, like the front camera, the side camera, they're another camera that just doesn't have foreshortening, so it's not perspective in that way. But we can create as many cameras as we want to, and a camera in here is an actual object that has similar properties to a real camera. We can adjust the lens length, we can adjust the focal length, we can adjust the placement, we can do a whole bunch of stuff in there. And so just so we know what we're going to be rendering, I'm going to go ahead and create a new camera. Okay, we can render out of this perspective camera, but just so I can make something interesting, I'm going to go ahead and create a new camera. So I'm going to go to Create, Cameras, Camera. And you'll see there's a handful of different kinds, but I'm just going to create a normal camera here. What you'll notice is that this camera is an object, right? I can move this up here. It looks like a little camera. Right? It looks like an old film camera, right? But this gives us an idea of what it is we have that we are going to be looking through. And this is called Camera 1, right? Now, again, if we look in our outliner, we can see Camera 1 in there as a new object. And just like any other object, I can animate this camera. Okay, so if I select it, hit S, move it a little bit, hit S, right? We got animation on that camera. Okay, I'm going to undo that for right now because I'm going to animate it in a slightly different way. Because doing that way, I can't see what's actually happening in the camera. So I can change my view to look through this camera. If I go to Panels, Perspective, you'll see now I have a new perspective camera. It's Camera 1. Right? We could name this camera whatever we wanted to, but I'll go ahead and leave it as Camera 1. And if I click that, now I'm inside of Camera 1. And when I move it around, I'm actually changing the location of that camera. If I go back to my previous perspective camera, you'll see now that camera is over here. Right? I'm going to set up my viewport here so we can see both cameras at the same time. So I'm going to go to Panels, Layouts, 2 panes side by side. When I do that, I have my perspective camera over here, right? And then I have my other camera over here. This is currently set to my side view. I can change this to Camera 1. And so now you'll see that as I change this camera, it updates on the other side. Right? So we can change what we're seeing through there. So the problem right now is what we're seeing through Camera 1. Let's look at the shape of that image, right? Right now it's narrower than it is tall, right? Which is sort of like the shape of a piece of paper. But that's not the shape of a movie image, right? Like a movie image is wide and narrow. It's kind of more like the shape of that whiteboard in the back of the room, right? Or I guess more appropriately, the shape of our screen here, right? Yeah, so 16 by 9 is the standard HD shape. It's not always that shape, depending on what you're rendering to. Old standard definition was 4 by 3, and so there's a whole bunch of different ratios of height to width, right? And currently our camera is actually set to an HD setting. But what we're seeing in our viewport is just whatever shape we want to, right? Or whatever shape Maya feels like showing us. So I want to see what the actual shape of my camera is, because if I hit render on this screen right here, I need a light in here, but let's go ahead and go to Arnold. I'm just going to add a sky dome light so I have some light in the room. And if I go ahead and render this, what you'll see is it's going to render it in this shape, right? So I need to know what is going to be outside of my render. Like, see how it's cutting off the bottom of my bridge there? But in my viewport, it's not, right? In my viewport, I can see that. So I need to know what's actually going to be visible in this render, right? So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and close this down. All of that information comes from our render settings. And we're going to be in our render settings a lot today, right? So our render settings, we have these 4 clapboards up here. It's the one with the little cog on it. Usually that's just sort of a standard symbol for settings in any program is that cog. And so if we click on that, it's going to open up the settings for our render. Okay? A couple of things you'll notice. Right now it's set to render in Maya software. That's the one that doesn't render very well, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and just change that to Arnold. So Arnold Renderer. You'll see that there's other kinds of renderers in here. There's Hardware 2.0, there's Maya Vector. But this, by changing that to Arnold Renderer, that's going to change some of our settings in this common tab to be more appropriate to what we're wanting, right? So the size and shape that this object is going to render is down here about halfway through on image size. And you'll see that it's currently set to HD 540. Right? That number in HD, you've probably seen that before, HD 1080, HD 720. That number is the number of pixels tall the image is, right? And so if I click on HD 540, that's like pretty low definition. You'll see that what it's actually going to render is 960 pixels wide by 540 pixels tall, right? Most of your TVs are probably HD 1080, like we're slowly getting away from HD 720. And so if we go and change this to HD 1080, there it is, HD 1080, you'll see that the resolution it's rendering is 1920 by 1080. So it's 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. Okay? So we need to change that before we do anything. And now, once I've changed that, you'll see that if I go in here to Arnold and render, the render view is actually going to be bigger. Like the image that it's going to render is actually significantly bigger if I do 1:1 so I can see the whole thing. It's going to take up most of my screen, right? If not all my screen, right? And that's what I want. Like I want to be able to I want all of these pixels to entirely fill this screen when I hit play, right? That means Maya's going to take a little bit more time to render this, though. You'll notice that it's not finished rendering yet, and I haven't even changed any of my settings yet. So, did it finish? It did. It took about 30 seconds to render a frame, right? Now, a couple of notes I'll make really quickly on lighting. I know we went over lighting a reasonable amount the other day. If you look really closely, we'll see that there's like some little artifacting here. Like it's very noisy. Like it's like got little speckles all over it. That is the samples. So on our light, if we have our light selected, there's a thing under here that says samples. Cranking that up to 5 will give us a much better render, but yet again, it's going to drive our render time up, right? So if I hit 5, I'm guessing this one's going to be closer to like 40 seconds or something like that. Okay. I still haven't quite answered, though, how do we make sure we're seeing the right thing in our viewport, right? Because I want to animate my camera, and I want to make sure I don't trim off something that's really important, right? So it's still rendering. Let's see. Should finish here in just a second. So what I'm going to do for that, I just want to get a good idea on what a frame of this will be. So that took 33 seconds to render that one image, and it's a little bit better now, a little less noise on that. Right? So we can do the math on that to figure out how many minutes or hours it's going to take to render your movie. I know that sounds intimidating. Give me a minute. I will show you how to use the render farm as well, or I'll show you a video that shows you how to use the render farm. But some of you may not want to do that. Some of you may still want to render on one computer. So just budget your time so you have enough time to render this out. Like maybe you're writing an English paper, come in here and render while you're writing that. One of the cool things about this is we can render individual images. So if you render half of it and then suddenly you have to leave, you can stop the render, go home, and come back and start rendering from where you left off. Right? So again, let's look at how we can see that shape inside of our camera though, right? Because this is what we're rendering from, and that's the wrong shape. So if we look up here in the top of our viewport menu, so we have our main menu up here, but there's all of these buttons up here. Remember where we went to panels and all of that. You'll notice that there's a little box with a blue dot in it. You see that? This is called your resolution gate. Okay, G-A-T-E. Right? Gate as in something that is blocking for you, right? And what this is going to do is it's going to put a template over top of our camera so we can see the shape of our render, right? So if I click on that, it's kind of hard for you to see in here now. Let me kind of maneuver this so you can see it, right? But you'll see that it kind of put a box around everything. It's kind of hard to see just because of the color of this object. So let me change that color so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. So you can see what it did is it put this box around here, and now this is the shape of what is going to render. The stuff that's outside of this box, this little piece here, isn't going to. Everything that's in here and clear will. And so this now means that I can actually create some animation on my camera if I wanted to, right? So let's say I wanted to do a slow push around this. Let's do some quick animation on it. So I can select my camera over here, or if I want to select it from this viewport, I can click this little camera button here, and this will select whatever camera I'm looking through. So by doing that, that selects my camera. And since that's selected, just like any other object, I can hit S to set a keyframe on it, right? So I can set a keyframe there on frame 1, right? And then I could go out here to frame 120, and I can move my camera to a new location, maybe over here, right? Again, make sure my camera is selected, hit S, and what you'll see now is when I hit play, I got some camera animation, right? Just like anything else, Maya is going to try to figure all of this stuff out in between. And so that means like this shot isn't that great. Like once we get halfway in here, we have to tell Maya, no, I'd rather you be more like this. Right? So I can move my camera to there and hit S, and I'm setting another keyframe. And so now what I get just with those 3 keyframes is a little animation on my camera, right? So that's 120 different images that make up that animation. And so if I'm going to render this, I need to render each of those animation or each of those images, right? It's very easy to render a single image. We've already seen a couple of ways of doing that. We can click the clapboard, right? And that's going to render one. Or I can, it's going to take in a minute. Don't crash. There we go. Escape will sometimes kill a render or cancel a render for you. We could also do it through this Arnold Render view, right? And so we can render a single image very easily. But what we're needing right now is for Maya to render every one of those frames, okay? And that goes by one of 2 names, depending on which method you're using. It's either render sequence or batch render. Batch render should work. Batch render basically means Maya is going to run a process where it renders each of those frames and saves it for you, okay? With Arnold, sometimes batch render gives us some problems, and there's basically another iteration of batch rendering called render sequence, right? We'll look at that in just a second, But before we start rendering all of those images, we need to make sure all of our settings on them are correct, right? So let's go back to our render settings again. And so a couple of things you'll notice here. First, the renderable camera it's set to is perspective, right? So I just did that animation on camera 1. If I were to hit render right now, it would just render 120 images from the perspective view instead. So I got to remember to change that to the correct camera. Okay. Up here at the top, I can give it a name. Okay, I'll call this in-class test. Go ahead and hit enter. And so I want you to notice something, because a question I get a lot is, where did my renders go, right? That depends. If you set your project, which you should have before you opened your file, right, then your images are going to go under the images folder under your bridge folder. Right, if you go to your bridge folder in your hard drive or whatever, under images, it's just going to start plopping your images in there as it renders, right? One at a time until it gets all 120 of them, right? If you haven't set that, it can go wherever your project is set, right? If you just open the computer and never set your project at all, it's probably dumping them into your My Documents folder somewhere, and I can kind of help you dig around to find that. There's a couple of different places they'll put it. Or if you're working on another project and you still have the project set to it, it will dump them in there. But the thing you need to realize is that if you render at home and you didn't set your project and you come to class with your hard drive, well, all of your files are at home, right? And so you don't have them, right? So that's one of the things, like this is another reminder of why we set our project, is because this is very finicky. Now, directly below that, if we look up at the top there, it'll tell us path. It's putting it in my bridges images folder. And the file name it's going to render is inclasstest.exr. What's an EXR file? Anybody ever heard of one of those? Anybody? Okay. An EXR file is just another type of image file, but it's a really robust kind of image file, right? So JPEGs are really common. We could render to JPEGs. JPEGs, though, they compress your information, right? So we have all of this information in here, all of these pixels. Each pixel has a red, a green, and a blue channel to it. And a JPEG is going to take all of those little pixels and try to simplify it as much as it can. And that's why sometimes images you download off the internet are kind of artifacty, like they have like little like weird things all in them, or it has like banding or something. That's because they were compressed too much. Like we've worked too hard on this to compress it down to something low quality, right? A PNG is a little better, and PNGs have something a JPEG doesn't, which is transparency, right? If you render a PNG with an alpha channel, you can actually you can see through parts of the image where you can't a JPEG. You can a GIF or a GIF, whichever faith you belong to. However you want to decide that or argue about that, whatever, go have it out. I don't care. But that means a PNG has an extra channel, right? We have red, green, blue, and alpha. It's 4 channels, right? And so that means it's storing a little bit of extra information, right? The thing you need to recognize about an EXR is an EXR can have an unlimited number of channels, and its red, green, and blue channels are not just a 0 to 1 value. It's an infinite value, which means after I've rendered this, I could take my EXR into Premiere or Photoshop, and I could do a little bit of extra work on it to make the lighting look better. And with the JPEG, I just have what the JPEG gave me. I could try to push and pull that, but it's going to start getting weird. You all have like done some weird effects on your pictures, and it just starts getting like, oh, I pushed the contrast too much or whatever. An EXR will allow you more room to adjust that, right? Because of all that, the files are bigger, and for the most part, the only thing that will really open in are Photoshop and Premiere, right? Those are the only 2 programs that we have on this machine that it will easily open in, right? Luckily, those are the 2 programs we're going to use, so we're going to render to EXRs. Later, you'll learn that we can do a lot with this in terms of effects. we can bake in a channel that tells you how far away an object is. And that means you can composite things into it and blur things so you can fake depth of field, right? We can hide all sorts of different information in there to allow us to sort objects. We could put a color channel in there that separates the characters from the background. So we could just apply a glow filter to the characters, but not the rest of the image, right? So there's a lot of use in that. You'll learn a lot about that in some of the compositing classes and effects animation classes. So right now, though, we're just going to use a straight EXR, and I'm fine with how this is set up right now, just by default. Now, the thing we need to note next is the fact that down here, frame range, where I want to tell it how many of these images to render, which of these frames do I want it to render, all of that is grayed out, right? It's as if, it's basically saying, no, we're not rendering a range of frames, we're just going to render one image, right? And if you scroll up here to metadata, name, type, value, all of that stuff, you'll see that this frame animation extension is set to single frame, right? So what this is saying is, like, when we render out these images, it's going to name it in a certain way. And how we want it to name it is the name of the file, a number, and that number is going to be your frame number, right? And then the extension, .jpeg, .exr, .png, whatever, right? And so right now it's just set to name extension. There's no number in there, so it doesn't know that we want to render more than one image, right? So if I click on that and drop that down, I usually choose either name _ number extension or name .number extension. The most important thing to remember, though, is extension is at the end. If you do that the other way, where number is at the end, then that means Maya is going to think that this is a .0001 file, right? And there's no program that opens a .0001 file. So what you would have to do is go through and manually rename every file that you rendered out, right? So we're going to do name _ number extension. Okay. And once we did that, I want you to notice a couple of things that changed. Now we can edit this. Right? Now we can put numbers in there. And if you look up here at your path, at the very top up here, the path is still the same, but the file name has changed, right? Now it says in class test _ 0001.exr to in class test _ 000 or 0010, right? So that's telling us what all of our frames are going to look like. So frame 1 is going to be 0001. We do this because when we go to Premiere, Premiere will automatically recognize that image sequence as a series of images, and it will bring this giant folder full of images in as a video, right? It will allow us to just take all these separate images and make them a video. So I'm going to set my frame range. Right now, I'm going from frame 1 to frame 120. Again, you'll see that changes up here. Right? And I think for the most part, that's all I'm really going to worry about right now. So quick overview again, change the name, EXR, name _ number extension, set your frame range to the range you want, set your camera to the camera you want, set your image size to HD 1080. Okay. You could render to something smaller. I wouldn't really mind for this class, but for the midpoint review class, you're going to need it in HD 1080 anyway. So that just means you would render it twice. So I would go ahead and target rendering the big one now. Okay, so if I close this, all of that will be saved with the Maya file. If I go File, Save the file, all of that information will be saved in the file if you open it correctly. So how do I turn this into a series of images? I'm going to go to the Rendering tab. Okay, so we got Modeling. If I go down here to Rendering, there's a couple of different places that this will work. So the first one is Render, Batch Render. Okay. This is probably the one that works the easiest when it works. We have paid for a license of Arnold, the renderer, but I'm not sure that all of the licensing has worked correctly in all of the labs. When it doesn't work correctly, it gives you a watermark. It says Arnold across it. I can show you an example of that. But the render will still look good. It'll just have a watermark on it that says Arnold, so you couldn't make money off of it, right? Hopefully that's fixed. If it's not fixed, if you end up having to turn in a file that has an Arnold watermark, I understand. That's not too big of a deal to me right now. Again, you'll probably want to re-render that before you submit that at midpoint review. But sometimes batch render just gives you an error. And when it does, that means you have to use the one right above it, render sequence. The benefit of using batch render is you pretty much click that button and Maya does all of the rest of it in the background. Render sequence pops up the Arnold Render viewer and renders it one frame at a time and saves it in front of you. So render sequence kind of bogs down your computer a little bit more. They both will slow down your computer significantly, but render sequence pretty much takes over the whole thing, right? So it depends on which one is going to work for you. You may have to try both. So I'm going to go ahead and try batch render and see what happens. Now when I click this, what I want you to pay attention to is this line on the bottom right here, this little black line, where usually there's not very much information. You will get information in that line when Maya is doing something, right? If that line ever turns yellow or red, that means there was an error, right? If you're doing something, that line turns red, like go read what that line says, right? And so one of the ways we can see that is if we click this button right here, it'll pop up all of the little notifications it gets, right? This is the script editor. But I'm going to go ahead and do render, batch render. Go ahead and click it. And so rendering with Arnold Renderer. Okay, so we get this down here at the bottom. And let's see what happens. It'll take it a second to get it started, I'm sure. But what should happen is, yeah, there we go. It'll pop it up and it'll say rendering 10% of the image in class test 0001.exr. Okay? That's your information. That's all you really get in terms of like what Maya is doing. Other than the fact that Maya will be all but unusable right now because it's going to be really slow. It's using up a lot of processes. Interestingly enough, Maya is not what is rendering right now. Arnold is. And although it's a little dangerous and sometimes can cause crashes, I can actually close Maya and Maya will continue to render. Because what is actually rendering is the Maya batch program. I'll open this up and show you. Task Manager. Details. There we go. So we'll see that Maya is running, but then there's also this program that's called Maya batch.exe. Right? And that's the thing that's using 92% of our CPU. Right? And so that's why it's going to slow it down. So literally, I could kill Maya exe and it will keep running. Sometimes you have to, and so that's something to check with. If Maya crashes mid-render, go look and see if Maya batch is still running. It may still be rendering in the background, right? Strangely, sometimes you may sit down at a computer, log on, and it's moving really slowly. Pop this up and see if Maya batch is running, because that's what the render farm does. Is basically it kicks out all of these different renders to each of these computers and opens up Maya batch and just runs Maya batch on the computer while it's idle, right? So I wanted to show you this. Now, what is it doing? Like we see here that we're on image number 4 of in-class test.0004, right? So let's go look at where that image should be placed. Oh, where's my mouse? Oh, there we go. Sorry. File Explorer. There we go. And so I'm going to go to my Documents, Bridge, Images, and you'll see that these are all previous renders, right? I'm going to organize these based off of information here, and I will sort off of date. And what we should be getting I don't know why it's, oh, just slow. There we go. So what you should be getting up here at the top is this in-class test, right? See that each image is like 16 megabytes, right? It's pretty big. These will start to take up some room. I'm going to go ahead and open one of these images with Photoshop, just so you can see it. So, whenever I open an EXR, I get this question. Do I want to open it as a transparency on our alpha channel or as an alpha channel? It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and say as transparency. And this is what I'm getting out of there, right? So it's a pretty nice looking render. I think it's worth showing you that, I believe this will work. If I create a new layer in here and put that underneath our image, and then oh, really? All right. Well, this will work better in Premiere, but I'll show you. Don't merge. Huh. I'll show you in Premiere later. But basically, oh, I guess it's because never mind. It's because I have the sky dome back there. So basically, we can render in a way to where we can put whatever background we want back here, because it will save that as a transparency, right? So, but again, the cool thing about this is that I can, let me undo some of that stuff I just did. I can now do adjustments on this, and I get way more control out of how much of that information is preserved, right? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my render. Even though it's rendering, I'm up to frame 10. Again, you can kind of do the math to see how long this is going to take you on yours. But I already have some images rendered somewhere else, and I'll show you the second part of this using some of those. So let's go ahead and go to render, cancel batch render. Yes, so that's going to go ahead and kill my batch render. So let's go ahead and minimize that. I'm going to, I have some images up on the network that I can show you this next part. So when you're all done, you're going to have this large pile of images, right? Here's 120 frames of a character that you'll be using later called BinBot, right? And so this is what I'm looking for, is this collection of images. I'm not going to copy them down. I'll go ahead and be using them from here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Premiere. Now, how many of you have used Premiere before? Okay.
I've used After Effects, not Premiere.
So After Effects will actually do this as well. If you're more comfortable in After Effects, you can compress it in there, or not compress it, convert it in there. Just like anything else. Has anybody else used After Effects instead of Premiere? All right. So either of those will work. I don't know why Premiere, like, yes, that's great, Premiere. We know you make movies. So Premiere is a video editing program. There's a whole class on how to use this, multiple classes on how to use this. I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version, right? This is not, like, James Livingston is rolling his eyes at me right now somewhere, because like I'm sure I will oversimplify a lot of stuff. But what we use Premiere for is editing video together. And really what we're needing it for is just to take an image sequence, make a few tweaks to it, and turn that into a video that anybody can double click on, or we can upload to YouTube or whatever, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and click New Project. Because I'm not really too concerned about editing anything. I'm just using this for conversion. I honestly don't care about very many of these settings. It's just going to put something in my Documents folder. I'm like, okay, whatever. Don't send. Really? Thanks, Premiere. Let's try that again. This may not work. There may be a trick to this that I am unaware of. New project. Okay. Yes. There we go. I don't know what happened there. So we'll kind of look at the overview of this really quickly. All of these two windows here are where we can either store our media or make changes to our media, right? And both of them kind of can mix and match. We can move windows around and stuff. But this section over here currently has nothing in it. This is our timeline, just like any other timeline in Maya. But we can have multiple layers of videos to edit together over here, right? And then this scene up here, this box up here is going to be where we actually see our final edit of the video. But currently we have no media in here. There's no movies at all, so all of this is blank. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click under our project. So project Untitled, right-click, and say Import. Okay. I'm going to point to my collection of images. Control-C, go ahead and paste that in there. Right? And I'm going to click on the first one. I don't have to click on all of them. If I clicked on all of them, it would import it in as 120 separate images. I'm going to click on the first one, and then I'm going to check this button right there where it says Image Sequence. You see that? So as long as I have the first one selected, it recognizes that this says 0001, and Premiere can count. It recognizes that the next one is 0002, and it says, ooh, I bet that one's next, right? So it figures out all of that sequence, and it uses that to turn this into a video. So when I hit open, it's going to import all of those images in. Now, it's important to recognize that each of those frames were 20 megabytes, and I'm pulling them over the network right now. So this video is going to play kind of slow, right? But you can see that I have, it's basically this little robot character jumping over a glowing box, right? So you'll be able to see it a little bit better once we're done here. Now, before I start editing this or exporting or anything like that, there's a couple of things I need to remember. Maya is animating at 24 frames a second. And all I told Premiere was, here's 120 images. And Premiere brought them in thinking he's editing a video, like film, or like on TV. TV is how many frames a second? About 30, like 29.97, right? So it brought in my 120 frames at 30 frames a second. And if I just exported that out, it would play it too quickly, right? It would play too many images in a second. So I need to let Premiere know that this is not 30 frames per second. This is 24 frames per second. So I'm going to right-click on this little video here. And I'm going to go to Modify, Interpret Footage. And you'll see that right now, it thinks the frame rate is 29.97. I'm going to tell it to assume the frame rate is 24. And that should have fixed it. The way we can tell is that the length of that video is now 5 seconds instead of 4 seconds. So if we would have left it that way, it basically would have sped it up by a second, right? And when it's only 4 seconds long, that's a fifth of it, right? So we have this now. But we don't have a timeline. We just have a video that's sort of stuck in our file here. You can see like a little preview of the animation, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag from here and drop here. Okay. And so now I have my animation. Now, I could drag a whole bunch of these. I could make these back to back over and over and over again, so we just get to watch that animation over and over again. And if I scrub my timeline, it looks like nothing's happening. It's just updating really slowly because it's pulling big images from the network, right? So when I have that all done, I just have one image in here. I want to export this out of Premiere into a movie file. So,
That's for a wacky.
oh, that's cool. I didn't know if you had a question. So, one of the things I do want to show you, sometimes you're going to bring this into Premiere, and it's going to seem too bright. like you're like in Maya it looked good, but here it looks too like washed out. That's an issue with the gamma settings. That's something you'll get into a lot more in lighting and rendering. But basically, it's just a way that images interpret the difference between completely white and completely black, right? And most JPEG images kind of scrunch more of that image, more of that information toward the middle, because those really white areas, like those washed out areas, we usually have a tendency to lose information there anyway. And the same in really deep shadows, we lose information there. So they were like, in order to make this more efficient, we'll like sort of stretch that out. And Arnold is actually going to render in a different way, so it's going to look like your image is washed out. We just have to do a gamma correction on that. So if yours looks good in this preview here, you're like, never mind, like run with it. Just go ahead and don't worry about this part. But if you need to darken this up or make this more contrasty, under this effects tab here, under video effects, and under, I think it's under adjust. No, I'm sorry. It's going to be under, there's like 3 places, image control. So under image control, there's this gamma correction. So this is just an effect I can drop on this video. So if I drag this and drop it on there, doesn't look like anything happened. It put it on there, it just didn't change any of the settings. So if we go to these effects controls, you can see that my gamma here is set at 10 by default. If I start turning that up, I can get a little bit more contrast and more, like that starts to look a little bit better, right? So we'll say something about like that. I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So if I play this, again, it's going to play it kind of jumpy. It's trying, right? But I think it's all working now. I just need to turn this into a video, into an MP4 file, okay? So I'm going to go to File, Export, Media, and don't ever, ever, ever use AVI. I know AVIs are everywhere, and people, like, that was sort of like a default Windows video for a long time. AVIs are just nasty, nasty files. Like, they're not, nobody is going to use those in 10 years from now, except for the people who are still using, like, whatever. So we're going to click on this. We're going to change this to H.264. Okay? Like, I know that, like, probably in your head, you're being like, why can't they just name that something that makes sense, right? Recognize that all of these words that don't seem to make any sense, H.264, AVI, even MPEG, right? Those come from different standards that were established by organizations about how to compress this, right? These are called codecs, compressors and decompressors, because right now I have a whole bunch of 24 megabyte images, and if I try to crunch all those into a movie without compressing them, I would get an enormous video file that, you know, some computers wouldn't be able to play or would take too long to stream off of YouTube or whatever. H.264 is the best codec out there right now in order to make video. So I'm going to take this file that is probably a gigabyte worth of images, and it's going to scrunch it down to maybe like 2 megabytes worth of video, and you're not really going to be able to tell any loss at all, right? So if I click H.264, it's going to set all of my settings for that, hopefully correctly. And in most cases, if you haven't changed anything else, that's enough for what we need for this class. Livingston can show you some very nice tricks on how to adjust your bit rate and stuff down here to make this even better. But I'm just going to leave it on the standard H.264, and I'm going to hit, before I do anything else, I'm going to change this to another name, right? Sometimes if you don't change this, it gives you an error on exporting, right? So I'm going to export this to my documents. I'll call this, actually I'll go ahead and put it in my bridge folder, maybe under movies. Movies is a nice place. And I'll call this binbot jump, okay? And I'm going to hit save and export. And it's going to take it a few seconds, but it's going to crunch all of that down into a video, okay? several seconds, 4 minutes, who knows how many. Like it's pulling it over the network, and like again, like it really just depends on how fast the network is right now. Come on, you can do it. 4 minutes and 6 seconds. Oh, okay. So anyway, as it's doing this, what this is exporting out right now is what you'll turn in. It should be a video that looks great and is the right size and everything. I know that was a long way to go. How are we right now? So I got about 45 minutes worth of video here of me explaining this process. I have a couple of other shorter videos that goes through it a little quicker, but maybe doesn't cover everything. So you should be able, like when you're ready to render, just pop this video up, watch me go through this process, and just kind of follow it step by step. Occasionally, people will forget the render settings. I can always take a picture of that or a screenshot of that and show you as well. But a lot of this is trial and error. I know that for you right now, this is probably one of the first times you've gone through this entire process, right? Maybe you've played around with Maya and some other classes. Maybe you've played around with it on your own. But it's okay to hit speed bumps on this, right? I recognize that I have been like hurtling information at your face, right? And it's really hard to keep up with that sometimes. Don't worry about that. This is not one of those classes where if you missed some specific like direction, that you're lost forever, right? The most important thing to remember, and I would say that this is probably pretty ubiquitous across most digital media classes, is that it is possible, right? I am showing you, you can render all of these things out and you can get a nice looking render, and here's the ways you do that, right? But you don't have to memorize the ways you do that. You just have to remember it's there, right? Because when it's time for you to do it, you may have to figure that out again and be like, wait, how do I render again? And you go and you click some buttons. And you're like, no, it wasn't that one. Oh, it was this one. And you click that and you're like, oh, no, that doesn't look right. Oh, yeah, I forgot to put a light in. And you make changes to that light. I could sit here and talk all day long. I've proven I'm capable of that. And not all of that's going to stick with you, right? Like some of it's going to stick in with you. Some of it's going to bounce right off. Some of it you're going to kind of hear part of it and be like, what? It really is until you've tried it, you mess it up, and then you figure it out for yourself that it sticks with you forever, right? And unfortunately, the only way to get there is practice. Right? More time sitting in front of the computer working on it. So if this feels overwhelming, that's okay. It probably should. Like this is a lot of stuff I've thrown at you. We have a little bit of work time left today, I think. Next class period is work time, and then Monday, I think, is also work time before we turn it in on the following Wednesday. Is that correct? That was the timeline we settled on? I think so, yeah. Or was it due Monday?
It was Wednesday.
Wednesday, I thought so. So we got a little bit of work time in here to figure some of this stuff out for you to like be like, wait, how do we do that again? And raise your hand and calm me down, and I'll help you with that. But what you're going to get the most from in this class is the time you're sitting in front of the screen working on it, right? So I encourage you to spend as much of that as you can in between now and Wednesday, like working on this, solving problems for yourself. There's not really a shortcut. There's not a super book I can refer you to that will teach you everything in one reading. Like the only way to get good at this stuff is practice. So let's look and see what the final export out of that is. Where did that go? And so what we should have gotten out of that is this video, right? And so this is from the Animation Fundamentals class. This will be the next animation class you'll take after the principles if you're interested in doing animation. And this is one of the last projects that they do as we get into character animation. This is also a little bit of a preview for you because, yeah, you'll get to use this character. I have a handful of other characters. This is one I just made for that class. But by the end of this class, you're also going to make your own two-legged creature and make it walk, right? And I'm sort of targeting a robot for that project. So be thinking about that. What would your robot look like? What would your two-legged creature look like? So I know that like this is all done with just slightly more advanced versions of what we've learned in this first few weeks of class. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. I want you to just take a deep breath and recognize that at one point I had no idea what the hell I was doing. Like I was like, I don't know what this button does, and I would freak out too, right? That's okay. Like you're gonna go through that, you're gonna fight with it, and that's how you're gonna learn this. And the way that you're gonna spend more time with this is if you're enjoying it. So make something you enjoy from here on out until this project's due. The class is work time, so I want to go ahead and stop the video unless anybody has any questions that they may want on the video. Any questions, comments on any of this? Okay, and then I'll upload that video before class is over, so you'll have that on there as well to follow through. So the rest of the class is yours. However you want to use it, you can keep working on stuff. You can go get dinner. You can go get whatever. If you're interested in the ID tech thing that we were talking about, feel free to come and listen to his talk tonight. It's 7:15 and room 195. But recognizing he's looking for people who are probably like the junior, senior level. But it's a pretty nice little summer gig. It's a teaching digital media summer camps. And so just to kind of know that that's on the horizon in the future if you're interested in doing that. Maybe meet some people and kind of, hear what they have to say. So, the rest of the class is yours. Let me know if you have any questions or need any help with anything. Let me go ahead and stop this recording.